In this lecture, we'll be talking about immigration and urbanization. Immigration, internal migration, and urbanization transformed American life. So during the late 1800s, early 1900s, in this period of industrialization, cities grew so quickly they became very overcrowded and dirty. There were lots of problems that occurred because of this rapid industrialization. One obvious is overcrowding. People were flooding into the city, immigrants coming in, millions of people at a time, and so they were forced to live in these crowded, rundown tenement buildings, which were basically just rundown apartment buildings in the slums of the cities. There were several families living in one apartment. They didn't have plumbing. There was one bathroom shared, maybe per floor, or even, one or two per building. So there was not a lot of space. The public services in the cities were very inadequate. They did not have enough hospitals. There wasn't police departments or fire departments that were equipped to handle the large volume of people living in the cities. There was no garbage collection. There was no sanitation systems, no sewers, no street cleaners. And so garbage would pile up along the streets. There was manure from the horse-drawn carriages. All the garbage just got thrown out into the street with nowhere to go. And so it was very disease-ridden and very dirty and smelly and disgusting. So this caused a lot of problems as well. Because of the overcrowding and the different ethnic groups that were coming in to live in the cities, there was a lot of social tensions that arose between the different groups and the different social classes and cultural groups. This led to a lot of crime. There was gangs that were starting to form and arise because of the overcrowding and lack of jobs availability and competition for jobs, and because there was such low wages during this time period that people were resorting to crime. And so there was a lot of increasing crime and gang violence during this time period. Again, transportation was an issue. There were horse-drawn carriages, electric trolleys that created a lot of pollution, subways later at this time creating a lot of pollution. So there was just a lot of issues that arose during this time period with the rapid urbanization that, nobody thought of how to deal with this before these issues came and before industrialization. So what made immigrants want to come to the United States? There were several factors that drew these new immigrants, this second wave of immigrants from 1890 to about 1920 into the United States. And some of these factors had to do with what things were going on within their country and what we had to offer as a nation. So the push factors were the things that were pushing them out of and making them leave their nation. The pull factors are the things that drew them to the United States out of all the other countries they could immigrate to. So many people were leaving their country because they were impoverished, they couldn't find jobs, there was a food shortage or famine, they were starving, so they were looking for opportunity and availability within the United States. They were leaving to escape oppression, either political oppression because they didn't have a voice in their government, they were under control of an absolute monarch or a czar, or religious persecution. They weren't free to celebrate their own religions and practice their own religion freely. Such would be an example of the Jews in Russia. Some people were fleeing their countries because it was at war and it was violent and dangerous, and they wanted to leave to have peace. And so people left and fled their country for those reasons, and again, to escape discrimination for various reasons. Some pull factors that drew people into the United States is that we had an abundance of jobs. We were an industrialized nation. We advertised that we had jobs available. Come to the United States, the land of the free. We have all these opportunities for people to grow economically. There's land available. We have plenty of food. We have natural resources. And we have religious and political freedom. So people felt that this was a great place to go to escape the problems that they were facing within their own country. So people flooded into the United States because we had an open immigration policy. And they came in through Ellis Island or Angel Island to the United States. And we're seeking these new opportunities that were available. So we had two different waves of immigration, and the wave of immigration during the industrial era was known as the new immigrants. The old immigrants were coming before 1890, prior to industrialization. They were coming primarily from Northern and Western Europe, Germany, Ireland, Britain, this homogenous kind of all the same religion. Most people were Protestant Christians, with the exception of the Irish. Many Irish were, Catholic. But you know, very similar in their backgrounds and all, Anglo-Saxon region of Europe. And then we have the new immigrants who were much more diverse. They're coming from Southern Eastern Europe, Asia, Latin America, countries like Italy, Greece, China, Mexico. And these people from these nations spoke different languages. They had different physical features, and all had different cultural practices and religions, from Jewish to Catholic to Buddhist to, you name it, Greek Orthodox, many, many different religions and cultures and languages and customs that were bringing diversity to the United States. But with that, and coming to the United States, sometimes they faced discrimination because of their differences as well. So once they came to the United States, they had to go through an immigration process. So their trip was usually involved, overseas trip, especially coming from Europe or Asia, upwards of a month or so. They would enter either through Ellis Island in New York or Angel Island coming from if they were coming from the Asian countries. They traveled usually in steerage, which was third class in the hull of the ship, and it was, crowded and dirty and unsanitary, and, not a pleasant trip over to the United States. And being there for 2 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on where they were coming from, that was not a very fun journey to get here. They had to go through health inspection and interrogation before entering the United States to make sure that they were physically able and capable and not fleeing their country because of any felonies or crimes and leaving their nation. We wanted pure, good citizens, hardworking citizens within the United States. Once they came to the United States, usually they flooded into the cities in the northeastern portion of the United States or into California in the western cities. They were living in tenements and living in ghettos or slums of the cities. Most people were working in factory jobs, low-paying, long-hour jobs. Many times, again, like I said, faced racism and discrimination from the nativists, those native-born citizens that felt superior or felt like they were better than the immigrants coming into the United States because of their different language or religion and customs. Many people wanted them to assimilate, these new immigrants to assimilate or Americanize themselves, drop their cultural practices and adopt the American way of life and English language and Christian religion and whatnot. Even though that wasn't required or forced upon them, they might have been discriminated against or treated differently because of their differences in culture. So here's just a couple pictures that you can see of the tenement homes. You can see on the left how crowded the buildings are, how they're almost on top of each other, very close together. You can see how crowded the streets were, and the problems that would arise because of that, because of the cities. And again, with inside the tenement homes, you can see they're very cluttered. It almost looks like hoarders, and very multiple families living in one place. Not very clean. So this idea of nativism grew as the population increased. These old immigrants, the native-born citizens of the United States, felt that they were superior to others. They believed in this idea of assimilation or Americanization, adopting American ways of life, trying to fit in. And the more different you may have been religiously or custom-wise or even looks, the more discrimination you may have faced. So one of the major groups that was targeted in the United States during this time period were Asian immigrants, specifically Chinese and Japanese. The Chinese probably being the biggest group targeted, but that was the largest immigrant group from Asia at this time. So we actually went as far as to pass laws that restricted or banned completely the entrance of Asians into the United States. So we have the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentleman's Agreement. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in, I believe, 1882, and it was originally only supposed to last for 10 years, but it ended up lasting almost 50 years I believe it wasn't repealed until like the 1940s. But this banned Chinese from entering the United States unless they were a diplomat, so working with the government for the government on special permission to enter the United States. And this was because we had such a large influx of Chinese entering the United States, forming their own communities, and just really kind of taking up the job market in the West and being blamed for creating lower wages and kind of putting, their stereotypes against the Chinese with their culture and language. And then, their work ethic was pretty strong. And so people felt intimidated by that. Were some of the ideas behind the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Gentleman's Agreement was similar, but not quite as extreme as the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it did limit the Japanese immigrants to only educated. It was like a deal that was made with the Japanese government that they would send their most educated immigrants to the United States, and then we would allow them to come in and integrate into American society. But these are just two examples of how we discriminated against different immigrant groups coming into the United States. In the next lecture, we'll talk more about discrimination towards different groups within the United States, including with a major focus on African Americans.